as people start to fill in, we can start, and I'll introduce you and we can go on.
Okay.
Sawa was in the house. For a student of mine, former student of mine, is attending. Very nice. We'll just give it a couple more minutes. Hopefully people aren't too burnt out after 3 days. It's not like they have flights to catch or anything. So. Okay, well, let's just get going, and if people come in, they can catch up. So thanks for coming to the session, the URPE session on informality, plus one. Mine is not really connected to informality in any way, shape, or form, but you know how it is. So welcome, everyone. We're going to have each presenter in turn present their paper, and then we'll have questions and answer and discussion afterwards. So we're going to break it into 4 separate presentation slots. And we're changing the order to allow people in different time zones with childcaring responsibilities, etc., to get some sleep. So we're first going to hear from Ceyhun Elgin of Boğaziçi University in Istanbul about sustainable development and informality. So go ahead, Ceyhun.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you again for understanding about the organization of the session. So today I'm going to be talking about the relationship between the informal sector and various sustainable development indicators. Actually, this paper is already very recent, actually was accepted by sustainable development, but we are still working on different extensions of it. So still, your comments and questions would be useful for us. And my co-authors are Adem Elveren and Gökçer Özgür from Fitchburg State University and Gettysburg College, respectively. So basically, the motivation in this paper was that, of course, from our intuition as well as on our reading of the literature on informality, which I really, had tried to sort of contribute in the past 10 years or so since my PhD thesis, informal sector or informal employment, the size of the informal sector, whichever measure you use, is related to sustainable development, either as a barrier to sustainable development, or it might, through different economic mechanisms, may have some effects on different aspects of employment, different aspects of development and sustainable development. Of course, economic development and sustainable development particularly is very hard to, quantify, to measure. It's sustainable development. Of course, if I ask you, what you understand from sustainable development, I am sure that you can come up with a list of different measures, variables, different dimensions of it. But it's hard to sort of in a sense, measure it in one sort of one-dimensional index or two-dimensional index, even though there are some different sort of measures, as you might all know. So in this paper, motivating from the very fact that informal economy constitutes a large share of economic life, especially in developing countries, we basically, wanted to come up with an empirical, whether to see with which sustainable development dimensions, factors, informality is associated with. In a sense, we want to quantify or unravel the negative impact of informality on sustainable development and on different aspects of sustainable development. There are different, of course, informality is hard to measure by definition, by its very definition, but still there are different methods used to estimate the size of it, the extent of it, or different aspects of it. I mean employment or value-added aspects. But generally the consensus is that it's really large, especially in the developing world. On average, is responsible a third of GDP. On average, I mean, there are countries in which it is 60% of GDP, such as Bolivia and Panama, or it's some sub-Saharan African economies, as well as some post-socialist transition economies. And more than 70% of employment, since it's a labor-intensive sector compared to the formal economy, it's much more in the employment in the labor market, 70% of employment in developing countries. And the question basically that we are asking in this paper is that how informal sector size is associated with different sustainable development indicators, which we are going to classify within different categories such as health, income, poverty, environment, education, and social variables. So what we do is that, of course, our benchmark analysis uses a specific measure of informal sector measured as percentage of GDP. However, for robustness, we also use some alternative measures. The benchmark measure that we are using is coming from a former paper of mine, which is hopefully going to be soon a World Bank working paper, policy working paper, which estimates the size of the informal sector as percentage of GDP for a large cross-section of countries over a very large time period. So we have many countries and many years. So we have a panel data basically. And then we use, as I'm going to show you, various different variables to measure sustainable development dimensions. I don't want to spend much time about what we mean by informality. I am sure that most of us working in, since this session is particularly on informal sector, I'm sure that the panelists and the attendees have a firm understanding of the concept. Generally, if you talk about informality in a developed country, especially where the audience consists of people from other fields, sometimes you need to define what you mean by informality. Because some economists may not necessarily know what it means. But for this particular paper, we are using these definitions as a joint definition from ILO and Viego that I am sure that most of you have already seen before. And we review in the paper different aspects of informality and different approaches that people are using to approach informality. And then, of course, we are trying to tie these causes or the approaches of informality with the causes of it, and especially link them to the different sustainable development indicators. Where, for example, these 4 distinct schools of thought, according to Martha Chen, the dualist, structuralist, legalist, and the voluntarist, which, in a sense, point out different dimensions of informality, and then of course one can tie these different dimensions to different aspects of sustainable development. If you are wondering about the overall data that we have about informal sector as percentage of GDP, this is simply an unweighted average of all these 160 countries for which we have data of, and we see a declining trend over time. And of course, even though there is a strong declining trend from 1950s to 2018, the last year, there are some ups and downs in different years. And also this is only the world average and the unweighted average. Unweighted average meaning that we are just summing over all the informal sector size as percentage of GDP and then dividing it by the number of countries. Of course, we also report in the paper weighted average, GDP weighted average as well, but for the sake of space and time, I just included this one here. And this is also another nice illustration of the data that we are using. Like all these 160 countries, of course, they are from different income groups. Some of them are richer, some of them are poorer. If you classify all these countries in different income quantiles, poorest 20%, second poorest 20%, and up to the richest 20% of all these, like, 160 divided by 5, 32 countries in each group. And then report the unweighted average, the evolution of the unweighted average of informal sector size in all these groups. This is what you get. I'm just showing this also, to motivate that even though, there is some substantial informal sector in developed countries as well. For example, 8% of GDP in the US, which is quite large, more than $1 trillion in total. As percentage of GDP, it's much larger problem in developing countries. And here we also have this, in a sense, a picture again, which is obtained from Martha Chan's book, and which is trying to show, it's called the Viego model of informal employment, illustrating the hierarchy of earnings and poverty risk by employment status and sex, and that it might also, it might be how informality might be associated with poverty, with gender equality, inequality, which are also part of the sustainable development measures. Now, what we are doing, so in addition to this informal sector data, what we are doing is that we are listing bunch of sustainable development indicators, and then use different panel estimation methods, panel data estimation methods to see how they are associated with the informal sector size. So here is a huge table that I can make a bit bigger, where in addition to the informal sector size, this is our benchmark measure of informal sector size as percentage of GDP. We classify this all the sustainable development measures under 1, 2, 3, 5 categories. The first category is the health-related variables, under which we have a bunch of variables which we have obtained from world development indicators. Life expectancy, infant mortality, neonatal mortality, access to water, clean water, immunization. And then we have some economic variables. We use GDP per capita just to see, but we also use a bunch of poverty measures, headcount and gap. And we also have access to electricity here as another economic variable. And then a bunch of environmental variables. There's a huge literature on the relationship between different environmental pollution indicators and informal sector size. And you might know the environmental Kuznets curve literature, and there are some papers out there, including one of mine, looking at the informal sector aspect of it. And then educational variables, and finally some social variables. Of course, the issue is that the size of all these series is different. Some series have a large number of observations, some have smaller number of observations, but so that's why each series might need a different estimation method. Since this is panel data, we check for panel unit roots. If there's a panel unit root, we may use panel co-integration. If not, we use fixed effects estimation with an AR1 autocorrelated errors. We use a bunch of diagnostic tests and try to use the appropriate estimation method depending on the sustainable development variable we use. We also use some IV estimations using lagged values of the variables as instruments for their levels. And what we do is that, I actually missed that, in addition to looking at the relationship between the sustainable development indicator and informal sector size, in the benchmark case, we also include an interaction term of the informal sector size with GDP per capita, in addition to the informal sector size, to see whether there is room for interaction, like, whether the relationship between the informal sector size and sustainable development indicators changes across different income levels. Like maybe it is, positive in richer countries and negative in poorer, or vice versa, depending on the sign of the estimated coefficient of the interaction term. And here we have the result, and generally we obtain, we report a bunch of results. This is one set of results that we report is in the benchmark without the interaction term. These are just the coefficients of the regression of informal sector size on the corresponding sustainable development indicator. And then we also report the same with the interaction term. So this is the panel regression and co-integration results. Again, we are using a different method potentially different method depending on the series. And we also, as I mentioned earlier, we also use the IV panel regression and co-integration results with and without the interaction term separately. I don't want to crowd all these slides with bunch of data series, but this is what it is. But what comes out of this generally, we list several variables that are consistently associated in all these estimations with IV, without the IV, with the interaction, without the interaction. And we basically list out some variables which are robustly associated in all these types of regression with informal sector size. And we identify in the paper different variables that are associated with informal sector size. We also, run a bunch of robustness checks, use some additional control variables. We run some systems estimations in which we estimate two equations at the same time. For example, if you focus on this one here, so these are generally, we are in these system estimations, we are using variables that are consistent associated with informal sectors as in the previous regressions. For example, here, just to read one, we are regressing life expectancy. LE means life expectancy. Life expectancy on informal sector size and GDP per capita. And then informal sector size at the same time to two potentially policy variables, tax burden and government spending. And for example, one policy recommendation that can come out of this system estimation is that higher government spending as percentage of GDP is associated with lower informal sector, and smaller tax burden is associated with smaller informal sector. And then smaller informal sector is associated with a longer life expectancy, for example. I am not making any causality arguments here. We are trying to be very careful, even though we run some IV estimations, but still, I'm trying to be careful here not to be strong about causality, but still, I think these systems estimations are useful in terms of some policy tools. And this is for life expectancy. You can get a similar result with poverty headcount ratio or poverty gap ratio, depending on the different levels of poverty threshold that you might use. This is using $50 per day. CO2 emissions, secondary school attainment ratio, or female labor force participation rate of the ILO, different estimates out of systems estimation. We have some systems estimation again for robustness with a different informality measure. As I told you earlier, we use a particular informal sector measure. We also, for robustness, use another measure. And then we also check, this was a request of a reviewer, where we, since our data is quite large in terms of the time series dimension running from 1950 to 2018, at the end, we divided the data set into two and then separated the regressions for the period before 1980, after 1980. Generally, the results are robust. And then the conclusion is that there are different, so we identify different variables such as poverty, education attainment, some health-related variables, including life expectancy, neonatal and maternal mortality, that are associated with informal sector size or with informality measures. Of course, this is a very macro analysis, and of course, a deeper understanding is very much warranted of this issue. And for this, we hopefully in the next step rely on household surveys in certain selected developing countries to identify exact mechanisms between these variables. And that concludes my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Jay. So we have time now for questions, comments for Jae-Hyun from the audience or from
I would
co-presenters.
be ready to answer any questions that you might have or any comments that you might have.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Jayan. I think my only question is, how do you think we should try to understand the sort of conflicting relationship of informality with, I mean, the negative relationship with life expectancy, etc., on the one hand, and the positive relationship with female labor force participation?
So one issue might be like informal sector sizes or informal employment is very asymmetric across different genders. And for example, I personally know it from the Turkish experience, the informal employment for females is almost, in terms of the rate, it's almost twice of the informal employment of males. So be that as it may, like informal sector basically provides the job opportunities for various female workers and asymmetrically, much more than their male counterparts. And in that sense, it might be one of the reasons why a larger informal sector is associated with of course, after controlling for different variables, especially GDP per capita, for example, in that particular regression, it might associate with a larger level of female labor force participation rate. Of course, this does not mean that we should use informal sectors. We should promote informality to promote to increase females labor force participation. And I see a question, by the way, from the question and answer tab of Zoom. Thomas, can I just read and answer it?
Yes, please do.
So how much of the results that informality is associated with greater, do you think is that to advance in survey methodology to better include previously hidden or underestimated employment thus increasing? So is that in advance in survey to better in, so the issue is that all measures are not based on informal employment. So so should I type the answer or okay, let me answer live. Okay, now maybe they are okay, they are listening my answer. So the thing is that the informality measure that I am using or that we are using is not informal employment as percentage of total employment or as percentage of total non-agricultural employment. The measure that we are using is informal sector size as percentage of GDP. So that is why I don't think that the results are coming out of the increase in the quality of surveys and measuring the informal employment better. So because we are measuring informal value added as percentage of total value added.
Following up on that has to also come from survey data as well, right? So to what extent do you think better survey data about value added in the informal sector might be playing into it?
We are not using survey data. We are using bunch of, so the data that we are obtaining for informal sectors as percentage of GDP is entirely based on some macro model. So it is not a model that is relying on survey data. It is using national income statistics and plug them into a model and back out informal sector size out of the model. And the alternative measure of informal sector size that we are using is coming out of another World Bank project, which is using a multiple indicators, multiple causes model, which is essentially a structural equation model, but which is also using macroeconomic data. So the two measures that we are using are both macro measures, not coming out of survey measures or micro measures.
Sure, although the national accounts come from surveys as well, right? So.
Yeah, that is true. That's but indirectly, yes.
Okay, any other questions for Jehan? Okay, going once, going twice.
Thank you for all the questions and thank you for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Jehan. It's a very interesting paper. And so if we don't get the chance before you sign off, good night.
Thank you. I will try to stay as much as I can.
Okay, great. Okay, well, next we will, where's my intro thing here? Okay, so next we will hear from the impact of, no, that's not me. about need or accumulation agrarian change in southern Haryana, a field-based study from Shrishti Yadav.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I'm going to just share my screen now, and I would appreciate it if you gave me like a 10-minute warning, if that's possible. But I'll keep an eye on my clock, I promise. Okay, so my paper is titled, the title that I originally submitted was Need or Accumulation, Agrarian Change in Southern Haryana. I promise what I'm presenting is pretty much the same with just like a different packaging. But I'm now looking at caste diversification and the contemporary agrarian question. I mean, the basic motivation, the aim of the paper is to study agrarian change in Southern Haryana through field-based data that I collected in district Rewari, in village Bastuda, district Rewari in the state of Haryana in northern India. The idea is to answer or to see what I can say about agrarian social relations of production, the interaction between agrarian social relations and diversification among agricultural households. And then also what I can say about the social aspects of this diversification, or the association between caste and processes of diversification. In this map, the district that's marked in red, that's Rewari district. And you can, this area right here is actually an industrial belt where a lot of international capital especially in the neoliberal era is congregated, which is one of the reasons why I think that Bastuda, which is located around here, is a good or an interesting field location, because A, it's near this industrial belt, and B, it's also very close to New Delhi. So it's close to essentially two centers which can sort of provide migrationary pull, which is one of the reasons why I chose this village to do my field study. So just brief outline of the presentation. I'm going to briefly go into why I'm framing this discussion in the agrarian question. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how this relates to the question of informalization, which is like why I'm presenting in this panel. Then I'll talk about my methodology and then my findings. So I'll go over a general overview of the village, and then I'll look into the specific questions of agrarian social relations, the interaction with diversification, and then trends in diversification themselves before offering a conclusion. Right. So why I frame my discussion and findings in the agrarian question? Well, the agrarian question has actually many iterations and it has a long history. But what the classic agrarian question essentially means is the changes necessary in the countryside to enable capitalist industrial development in a country. So the changes necessary in a country's agricultural productive forces and relations, which would enable successful industrialization. This sort of iteration of the agrarian question is usually considered to be dead now, especially in the era of post-colonial capital, especially in the era of neoliberalism, because as Henry Bernstein has pointed out over and over, in the era of neoliberalism, the linkages between domestic agriculture and industry are weakened, because now potentially domestic capital requirements can be met through international capital. So the agrarian question itself needs to be reformulated, especially the agrarian question of labor, and it needs to be reformulated around specifically the reconstitution of agrarian classes through diversification. So the fact that almost every agricultural household has some kind of a linkage with a non-agricultural activity, either through labor or as capital. Now, in India, where the literature currently stands on the agrarian question, is that there is agreement that agriculture is increasingly becoming capitalist, but there isn't agreement on how to characterize these social relations. especially because it's recognized that agriculture is becoming capitalist, but not in the classic way, in which there is a strict polarization between capitalist farmer and landless worker. So how my project relates to informality is actually at two levels, or at two questions. The first is the question of how agricultural production is to be characterized. So how the agrarian social relations themselves are to be characterized. Specifically, are these capitalist producers, or are they what has traditionally been called peasants, or are they petty commodity producers? This goes to like deeper questions of how to identify capitalist production. Is simply operating for the market enough to suggest capitalist production? Is hiring labor enough to suggest capitalist production? So there is a literature on this, which I go into in the paper. But specifically to identify petty commodity producers, there's a number of usually agreed on characteristics, which is that these households or these producers have a multi-class character. So they would usually combine labor and capital. And also that production is motivated towards household reproduction or need, as opposed to accumulation. And this in particular relates to the debates on identification of informality, because even as Jayun mentioned in his presentation, there are scholars who identify informality as a distinct mode in itself almost, or as a space in the economy which is distinct from the capitalist space. And here I'm talking especially about people like Kalyan Sanyal, but you can also see sort of this come out in dualist sort of interpretations of informality. So this is one way in which informality is coming in. The second is when I look at diversification itself, and which social groups or households are able to diversify into the formal sector versus the informal sector based on employment. Right. Moving to the methodology for my research. So as I said, this research is based on field-based data that I collected in Bastuda in June, July 2019. This was after an initial round of pilot fieldwork that I'd already done the year before. I conducted structured interviews with 75 households, which had both quantitative and qualitative responses on essentially household demographics, farm income, other sources of income, and some other miscellaneous questions. I also conducted focus group discussions with sort of caste elders in the village and other farmer groups and labor groups, and also semi-structured interviews with government officials. And I used the snowball method essentially to build my sample.
About 10 minutes to go.
Thank you. So general overview, the size of the village as per the latest government statistics that I could find is 506 households. So my sample is around 15% of the village. This is the basic caste breakdown of the village. Now you see the Varna and the Jati classification. So I mean, essentially, if I had to be very crude about it, 4 major castes which fall within the Savarna category are the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, or the warrior caste essentially, which here would be termed Rajputs, the Vaishyas or the merchant caste, which here would be Baniyas. These 3 are characterized in the government classification as other castes or general castes. Then you come to the 4th in the Savarna, who are the Shudras, the laboring castes. And this is in government classification, other backward classes. So in our case, Ahir, Khati, and Prajapat. And then outside of the 4 caste hierarchy, below the 4 caste hierarchy, to be more precise, are the formerly untouchables, also referred to as Avarna, or contemporarily would be called Dalits. In the government classification, referred to as scheduled castes. In Bastuda, the scheduled castes are Harijan, Dhanak, Nai, Valmiki, and Bavaria. Now, the thing to note is that land is primarily concentrated with the Savarna castes, and especially within the Savarna, with the other castes and Ahirs, especially among the other backward classes. Avarna castes have historically provided agricultural labor and have historically been landless. And this is also represented, I mean, this is also reflected in my sample, where you see that Avarna caste, so 28% of the sample are only 2% of the landowners. And yeah, this is just a quick visualization of the caste breakdown of the sample and the caste breakdown of land ownership and sample. And you can see that backward classes, which again are predominantly, I'm talking about Ahirs here, are the primary landowners in the village. Continuing on land ownership, so I already said that land has traditionally been held by the Savarna castes. Average land holding is pretty small. 5.7 acres is around 2.28 hectares. And the largest land holding was also only 9 hectares, which basically means that in my sample, over, I mean, 75% of landowning households were small or medium landowners. And I'll just mention that according to Government of India statistics, only farmers with 10 acres land or above are seen to be consistently making a profit. And you can see that in our, in my sample, that's a very small percentage of the landowners. Right, now with this general overview, maybe I'll just mention that the major crops in Bastuda are pearl millet in the summer and wheat and mustard in the winter. And it's a drier area. Right, with that general overview, coming to the agrarian social relations themselves. So first I'll talk about the means of production. Land, perhaps the most important means of production, primarily is inherited in almost all the cases in my sample. But inherited land is often augmented through land leasing or renting. So leasing market is very active in the village, and almost 80% of the landowners in my sample were engaged in tenurial relations. The primary source for irrigation is groundwater, so private tube wells, and which in turn is reliant on subsidized electricity from the government. There is also some renting in of tube well services from neighboring farms. Seeds, high yielding varieties of seeds are used by almost all landowners in my sample, and so is our chemical fertilizers and pesticides such as diammonium phosphate, urea, zinc, potash, essentially indicating that the techniques of the Green Revolution, which is this whole bundle of new techniques in agricultural production, which were introduced in India and other developing countries in sort of the late 60s and 70s, those techniques are fairly generalized in the village. And relatedly, large parts of the agricultural production process are also mechanized. So especially land preparation, seeding, threshing, these are completely mechanized. Tractors and threshers are used for these processes. And there is also some households actually purchase these machines, and other households usually tend to rent in these machines. So these techniques of mechanization are also fairly generalized, and there is also an active rental market for them. Right, the labor process. Historically, through group interviews, I was told that historically, the agricultural labor process was dominated by Jajmani relations, in which individual Avarna households are tied to individual Savarna households to provide agricultural labor through caste-based relations of servitude. These Jajmani relations receded from the village in the 1970s, which essentially means two things. So, I mean, land continues to be concentrated with the Savarna households, But Avarna households are no longer tied to individual landlords. So they are doubly free, sort of in the Marxian sense. They're free from ownership of means of production because they don't own land. And they're also free to now work for any employer or migrate out of the village. Mechanization has led to a bunching up of agricultural labor demand, which basically means that older practices of hiring long-term farm servants doesn't hold anymore. And now the most common forms of labor contract are daily wage, so being hired for the day, or piece rated, being paid to do a certain amount of work or to harvest a certain amount of land. In fact, piece rated contracts are the most commonly found in my sample, and daily wage was actually the least preferred by landowners, though it was the most preferred by the laborers themselves, which is kind of, which makes sense because piece rated contracts are obviously, they tend to be faster paced, they tend to be more exploitative because it depends on the worker how intensively they work to sort of fulfill their contract as soon as possible. And this trend is also reflected in the fact that migrant labor is increasingly making up a larger and larger part of the labor process in the village. This migrant labor come from neighboring states, which are usually like poorer states. They come during the harvest season. They work in large groups, essentially harvesting together, harvesting an entire field together in like a much shorter period of time than an individual daily wage laborer would be able to do. But these are external labor contracts though. What I observe is that family labor continues to be important for Savarna landowning households. And I essentially estimate the reliance on family labor through the use of Utsa Patnaik's exploitation ratio, or E ratio, which is essentially a measure of total labor hired in over total family labor employed. I use a monetized variant of that. And what I basically find is that for 1/3 of landowning households, own labor is over half of all labor employed. And in fact, most households combine own labor with hired labor, most landowning households. And landowning households which did not use any family labor are usually households which are completely diversified into other activities, such as businesses primarily. Also important is that the top decile of profit rates, of agricultural profit rates in my sample have an average E ratio of 0.19, whereas the average E ratio for the entire sample is 2.8, which basically means that agricultural profits are still reliant on the exploitation of family labor or self-exploitation, which also means that there are limits to agricultural profits because it depends on how much family labor is available. This is the classic sort of peasant dynamic that Chayanov had pointed to. Right. So
that's time, but you probably have some more time since we have relatively few participants in the session. So
okay, I'm going to be quick though, I promise. Okay, very quickly. Within looking at agrarian social relations, if I were to divide agricultural households, landowning households, into whether they get most of their income from agriculture or not. So if they get most of their income from agriculture, they're majorly agricultural households. What I see is that actually diversifying into other economic activities does not necessarily mean that you invest in machinery, and it does not necessarily mean that you lease in land and cultivate on an expanded scale. You see the difference between the cultivation ownership ratio and the share of households investing in labor displacing techniques. Additionally, if you are diversified in other activities, then, I mean, this makes sense. You would also have a higher E ratio because there is presumably less labor to employ in own household agriculture. Now, what I propose in this paper is a sort of a preliminary claim, which is that if majorly agricultural households do invest more and they do cultivate on an expanded scale. That's because agriculture is the primary source for household reproduction, and not necessarily because of accumulative sort of tendencies by themselves. It's because agriculture is the primary source of household subsistence. And if subsistence is to be improved, that has to come from agriculture itself. So my sort of provisional conclusion for this question is that households' agricultural production is still embedded in, is essentially petty commodity production. It's not motivated by the logic of accumulation. And this is sort of augmented when I include sort of the qualitative evidence of when I asked agricultural households if they want their children to remain in agriculture. All but 2 of them, essentially, so 98% of them said that they would not want their children to be in agriculture. And most of them actually said they prefer their children to be in service employment, which is to say diversified into formal sector jobs with a formal contract. So coming to diversification, there is a big difference between the way land-owning Savarna households diversify and landless Avarna households diversify. Land-owning households, 22% diversified into merchant or commercial capital, which is, again, non-productive capital, I should emphasize. This is retail, real estate, money lending. This is not industrial production by any means. A large number of them are diversified into formal wage work with a formal contract. This is public sector employment. And then a small amounts into sort of informal sector regular wage work or other forms of sort of wage work, which is somewhat regularized. Whereas landless households, you can see 75% of diversification is into casual wage work and in fact, semi-bonded labor. So casual wage work is essentially in construction or in agriculture or in other types of activities. And I should mention that migration is fairly common in all of these economic activities. It could be daily, it's often daily, and often also weekly and monthly. But the daily type of migration is primarily sort of intra-district migration. And then the weekly and monthly would be sort of inter-district or interstate migration. Now, this difference in diversification is also reflected in household incomes, and again is strongly segmented along lines of caste and land ownership, where you see that wage work, landowning households, which get most of their income from wage work, have an annual per capita income, which is almost 5 times what it is for landless Avarna households. I mean, the kind of self-employment that exists for landless Avarna is very different from the kind of self-employment, which is the commercial or commercial capital that I have in this category, which exists for land-owning Savarna. Basically, what I think this means is that even though most agricultural households are diversifying into wage work, some kind of wage work, there is a big difference between the type of wage work that's available to land-owning and landless households, which are also at different ends of the caste spectrum. And this reality is, rather than describing it as a straightforward kind of proletarianization, this reality is better described as a conjugated oppression, in which the historical social relations of oppression of essentially of caste in this case, but they can also be of gender or tribe, are sort of reinforced and reinvigorated as upper caste dominant households are able to diversify into the new economy through formal jobs, whereas landless Avarna households are confined to precarious daily wage work. Yeah, that's where I'll end. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Shrishti. So do we have any questions, comments from our participants? I had, I guess, while we wait for people to summon up the courage to ask questions, a couple of things. Thanks for bringing in the Byers-Bernstein debate, which I always have thought of as, Lenin and China, fist fight in heaven, But when you mentioned that there's a large rental market for tractors and threshers and so on, is that generally from other peasants in the village that own their own, or is there some other source?
Right. It's actually others in the village who own tractors and threshers. And so, so in fact, the owners will themselves operate the machine on someone else's land. So they're renting out both their agricultural labor and the machine itself.
Gotcha. Right. Is that a major source of income for people who own tractors and threshers, or?
I looked into that, and it wasn't, because of two things. One is that Haryana actually has the highest density of tractors in the country, which means that there is a fair amount of competition in the market. And secondly, also, it's not, I mean, the costs of owning and maintaining a tractor are also not unreasonable. So usually there isn't a large amount of profit there to be made.
Gotcha. So then are people who are chiefly majorly agricultural, as you categorize them, are they majorly agricultural because they lack the opportunity to get into non-agricultural sources of income?
That's what it seemed like from their responses. Is all of them expressed a preference for non-agricultural sort of formal employment. So it did seem like they would, if given the opportunity, they would definitely step back from agriculture if they could.
Gotcha. So the constraint is the lack of opportunity for formal employment.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so it's the formal though, right? Because the informal employment is fairly well.
Is there, right? But it's not very remunerative. So, yeah. Okay. Great. So if there are no other questions.
There is a question in the chat.
Yes.
I'll just read it out for others also. Did you observe any indication of improvement of bargaining power of the landless laborers in their employment conditions? There have been some anecdotes of Narega work improving bargaining power in some parts of India. That's a good question. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there is definitely, I had Avarna labor respondents who categorically said that they refuse to, for example, harvest cotton because it leads to skin infections. So they would prefer to not work than to sort of work in adverse circumstances like that. This was also reflected in the Savarna landowners' attitude towards Avarna landless, actually, who said that they, it was basically in the form of resentment that, and it had a severe casteist angle to it. These former untouchables is how they would refer to them. They don't want to come to work anymore because they get rations from the government, and they only come in for these restricted number of hours, and they want a tea break and they want a lunch break. Whereas if, the migrant laborer will just come in and do all the work in one go. It doesn't have so much to do with Narega though, because this village hasn't seen Narega work. Narega is the employment guarantee scheme that the Indian government runs. This village hasn't really seen Narega work in quite a few years. But yes, given that there is access to other kind of non-agricultural economic activity, the Avarna laborers definitely have seen an increase in bargaining power.
And do you know if much of the village that you canvassed in your field work, did many of them decamp to Delhi? Are they part of the 2 million farmers outside of Delhi right now?
They are, it's difficult to say, but the protests are happening in different locations, and one of the locations is very close to where this village is.
Right.
It's definitely, they share the same concerns for sure.
Gotcha. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. And our fourth panelist, Amana, apparently is having difficulties with power and or connection to the internet, which, you know, that's, you know, living in a developing country, New York, comes with it, right? So if you don't know, New York's power grid is notoriously fragile. So we lose power quite often, although, you know, maybe not quite as often as in some cities in India, for example. But anyway, so hopefully he'll find his way in. Until then, I'll present next, and you know, I'll use my chairperson privilege to make that happen. So, oh, where is it? Okay. Here we go. Oh, for Pete's sake. You'd think I would be ready. You'd think. Okay, so here we go. Share and get the timer. Go. Okay, so I'm presenting about the impact of redistributing the responsibility for household work, unpaid household work, on time and consumption poverty. So I'm reporting on simulations we did for 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm part of a team, including myself, Ajit Zacharias, Fernando Rios Avila, Abina Odoro, and Luisa Nassif Pires. Other than Abina, we're all located at the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College in New York. Abina Odoro is from the University of Ghana. And this work is supported by the Hewlett Foundation, so not unlike the NewsHour. Okay, so let me get into it then. I'll briefly introduce you know, the project, and so I'm going to first talk about the motivation for the study, the data sources we use, and then talk about the framework that we use to analyze time and consumption poverty. And then talk about the redistribution methods that we apply to the data sets that we have, and then the results. So hopefully I can do all that in not too long a time. So the motivation for the study is goes back to Diane Elson's 3 R's, you know, so recognize, redistribute, and reduce and redistribute. And we've done the first 2, recognition and reduction, in part of as part of this ongoing research project on time and consumption poverty. The measure of time and consumption poverty itself embeds within it the recognition of unpaid household work. And 2 different examples of a micro model of social infrastructure expansion that we've done, one on Ghana and Tanzania, which was in a previous phase of this project that's also funded by the Hewlett Foundation, and also one on Turkey, which we presented yesterday. Pekka Ilkaranajan and I presented yesterday morning. So this project then is to look at redistribution. So we begin with, you know, the different theories of the allocation of time spent on work in the household, and you know, there are 3 basic categories run, right? One is based on available time. Another one is based on economic bargaining. So income or assets are frequently the kind of bargaining power proxies we use, or based on gender ideology. Now, the ones that we will be able to actually try to address with our data and our framework are the first 2. You know, so I'll circle all the way back to gender ideology at the very end. How would redistribution affect women's time use and household welfare are the questions we're going to be trying to answer with our estimations. Okay, so first to talk about the data. So we're working on 4 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and the first is Ethiopia. We're using the Ethiopia Socioeconomic Survey, the 3rd wave, and the Ethiopia Time Use Survey. And we're limiting ourselves to a subsample of married couple households because there is some trouble with the data. And if you look at the labor force indicator results from these 2 surveys, they look like they're different countries. So, but when we narrow it to married couple households, it looks a little better. So data limitations in that way. For Ghana, we're using the wave of the Ghana Living Standard Survey from 2012 and 13, and the Ghana Time Use Survey from 2009. And from South Africa, we're using the Living Conditions Survey from 2014 and 15, and the Time Use Survey from 2010. For Tanzania, we're using the Household Budget Survey from 2011 and 12, and the Integrated Labor Force Survey, which has a time use module from 2006. For Ethiopia and South Africa, these are new countries for us to be working on in this particular project. And so we created a new synthetic data set by statistically matching the household surveys and the time use surveys in order to produce estimates of our measure of time and consumption poverty, which I'll talk about in a second. For Ghana and Tanzania, we had already done those, so they were already ready. Our measure of time and consumption poverty, the Levy Institute Measure of Time and Consumption Poverty, or LIMT-TCP, starts with the notion of individual time deficits. So what we do is for households around the poverty line, we estimate the required hours of household production, right? So official poverty lines assume that there's time available to do the household work that's required, but they don't actually account for it. So this is a way to account for it, right? So we take the required hours of household production by looking at households around the poverty line with an adult who's full-time in the home. And then we divide that up for each individual by their observed share of household production time. And we subtract that from 168 hours per week. Right? So weekly hours of household production work, and we subtract out a minimum required personal care, which doesn't vary much across countries. It's usually between 90 and 100 hours per week. And then for people engaged in income generating activities, right, that's the D0, that's an indicator for engaging in income generating activities outside the house. The time spent on that, the LIJ, the labor time, and the time commuting, which especially in urban centers is very large for many people. So then if all of these things add up to more than 168, we say that person has a time deficit, right? And we're not going to look at time surpluses because they don't actually have an effect on the intra-household allocation when we measure time poverty, since we don't observe people reshifting their responsibilities for people with surpluses, from people with surpluses to people with deficits. So we add up all the deficits for all the individuals in the household, and that's the household time deficit. And then we adjust the official poverty threshold by using the household time deficit with the replacement cost, which we generate from the wages of domestic workers in each of the countries. So we get a time-adjusted poverty threshold, and we have a two-way measure for each individual and household of time and consumption poverty. So if there's a time-poor person in the household is time-poor, and if the household is consumption-poor, the person is too. Okay. So that's a really quick overview of that if you haven't seen it before, but I'll be happy to answer questions about it. So what we're really going to be focusing on in this project, though, is the alpha ij. So we're going to alter that for individuals in households with time deficits to see what impact that will have on both the time deficits of the people in the household and of the overall time and consumption poverty of households. Since shifting this is going to change this, and so change the adjustment, right? So some households that were poor might end up not being poor. Some households that were not poor, not consumption poor, might end up being poor. So it's not clear a priori what will happen. So how are we going to redistribute the hours? Well, we're going to use 3 different sharing rules. The first one is kind of a naive. First we have to start with the time that individuals have available for free distribution. And we're going to say it's the number of hours in the week minus the minimum personal care and their time spent on income generating activities. So the leftover time is what's available for redistribution. And who is eligible for to partake in the redistribution are working age people who don't have any physical impediment to doing more household work than they already do, and not time poor due to income generating activities alone. In other words, they have to have some time available to redistribute. Okay, so there are some people in each country who are time poor just based on their time spent on income generating activities, because hours of work and commuting time is very long in some countries, especially in Tanzania. Okay, so now we're ready. And how are we going to redistribute? Well, first, we're going to take an equal shares approach, which is kind of a neat, naive egalitarianism. So for every eligible working age adult in the household that has time available, we're going to take their share to be 1 over the number of people with time available. That's this RJ. So that's just an equal share. Everybody gets an equal share of the required household production work. Then we're going to use the time available, right? And so we're going to, for each available person, we're going to take their time available and divide it by the sum of the available time within the household, right? And use that as their share of household production work. And then we're going to use an opportunity cost, which is, so their share is inversely proportional with their share of the total hourly wage in the household. And for individuals that don't actually have, that aren't actually engaged in income generating activities, we impute the wages that we guess that they would make. And I can talk to you about how we do that as well. So 3 different ways to slice it up, 3 scenarios for each country. Okay. So how am I doing for time? I have 6.5 minutes left. Okay, I can do this. Okay, so so just for the baseline scenario here is the mean share of working age time poor persons in household production, right? So this is for all men and all women in each country, although in Ethiopia, this is just married couple households, right? So you notice there's a very stark difference between Ethiopia and Ghana, South Africa, and Tanzania, in that most men and women are in Ethiopia are married couple households without other working age adults, right? So that's why you get very close to 100% if you add up. What probably is not surprising is that there are big differences, right, between men and women. Whether you're consumption poor or not, there are large gaps in the share of household production work that women do and men do, right? What might not be as obvious is that in each country, at least that includes non-married couple households, the time spent for both men and women on household production work, the share is higher for non-poor than poor households. That has something to do with the relationship between household size and poverty. Okay, so that's the baseline. Now, so the gap is here, right? So that's directly from the previous slide. And these are the three scenarios: the equal shares, the time available, and the opportunity cost. So I include this just to show the one scenario, the one measure by which the equal share scenario is superior to the other two. In the equal share scenario, there's the greatest reduction in the gap. So this is the difference between the female and male share, right? So in Ethiopia, in poor households, women tend to do 46 percentage points more than men in terms of the share of household production work. That's reduced to about 8%. In Ghana, it's completely wiped out. In South Africa, for poor households, it's wiped out, very small. For non-poor, Tanzania, 2 and 4 percentage point difference in the equal share scenario, which, because we're looking at the difference between men and women, the equal share scenario ought to come out with the best results there, right? The time available has the worst results here, right? And this is because in all countries, women tend to have lower labor force participation, lower engagement with income generating activities in general. And then the opportunity cost scenario is somewhere in between. Okay. So looking at the change in the shares for working age time poor persons, right? There's a lot going on here, I realize. So for men and women in poor and non-poor households in each of the three scenarios, the blue bars are the equal share scenario, the orange bars are the time available scenario, and the gray bars are the opportunity cost scenario. So long story short, all three scenarios reduce the share of women, time poor women's share of household production. Okay. And across countries in poor and non-poor households, the time available scenario is the one that reduces it by the most. The time available scenario, by the way, also reduces men's share of time poor men's share of household production work across countries and poverty status, right? Whereas equal shares and opportunity cost does not. Except for poor men in Ethiopia. Okay, so there's a lot. I do apologize, there's just a lot in this that I'm trying to go over quickly and still have time left over for questions. So now I'm going to talk quickly about how congruent are reductions in time deficits with the welfare of others in the household, right? So, and we're going to look just at reductions in time deficits. And we're going to say strong congruence occurs when a reduction in time poor individuals' time deficit is accompanied by a reduction in somebody else's time deficits in their household. Okay, so not only is this person's time deficit reduced, but somebody else's is as well, right? Now, this requires there to be somebody else with time deficits in the household. Okay, so if there's nobody else, then you can't get a strongly congruent outcome. Weak congruence means that there's no change in others' time deficits. And the vast majority of cases where we get weak congruence is where there's is in households where only one person has time deficits. Right? So you can't get strong congruence, but you can get weak congruence. And then conflict is where the reduction in one person's time deficit comes at the cost of an increase in somebody else's. Okay? So that's those three outcomes. And this is what it looks like. So in each this adds up to 100%. So for cases in Ethiopia where a man's time deficit was reduced, this is the breakdown for those three scenarios. So 12% were conflictual, 64% were weakly congruent, which mostly means that the man was the only one with a time deficit in that household. And then strong congruence occurred when the man's time deficit was reduced and everybody else's was as well. Okay. Okay, and that's my time. So I briefly, what happens is that, so this is, most outcomes are congruent, right? The reduction in men's time deficits is more likely to be conflictual, less likely to be conflictual than women's. And the time available scenario, right? The center has the greatest incidence of strong congruence and the lowest incidence of conflictual outcomes. Okay, so in that sense, the time available scenario is the best one. Okay, so quickly, I'm just going to breeze past this, although there's a lot behind it. The blue and the green bars are people who are still time poor after the redistribution. All of the people represented in this bar graph were time poor in the baseline, and this is just for Ghana. But the point is that time poverty reduction is greater for women than for men in each case, and the time available scenario gives you the greatest reduction for both men and women, and also the greatest reduction in time consumption poverty, right? So the blue and orange bars are are consumption poor in each scenario, right? So sorry to go by this so quickly, but I'm out of time. So basically, the theories of redistribution that we test have one important thing in common in our findings. Neither one of them, the equal shares isn't something that's theoretically supposed to be in operation, but the other two, the time available and bargaining, don't seem to be in operation in the households in our study, at least to the degree that we're able to capture it, because profound changes occur in intra-household allocation when we apply either one of these allocation rules, right? If they were actually happening, right, trying to apply them wouldn't change much, but we see big changes, so it kind of implies that neither one is really that important, which circles back to gender ideology. So gender roles are an important constraint on equitable redistribution. Not the most shocking, probably, conclusion that we could have come to. But based on our simulations, the best approach depends on how we define equity, right? If we're looking just at gaps, right, that was that first table, then the equal share scenario is superior. But the time available approach most effectively reduces women's time poverty and also reduces men's time deficits and the household time and consumption poverty, right? So the opportunity cost approach is not optimal in any of the ways that we assess equity improvements, right? So much for neoclassical theory. Take that, Gary Becker. Limitations of our study is that we don't simulate reallocation of time spent on income generating activities. That's a whole nother can of worms that we didn't open. And labor market conditions in the countries in our study, as they are elsewhere, are inimical to the needs of households around care provisioning, which presents another barrier to redistribution, right? There's long hours and inflexible and inconvenient schedules, lack of social infrastructure. They're also stacked against women, right? Gender pay gaps are there, occupational segregation is there, and there's a lack of opportunity, which in many cases is constrained by unequal educational opportunities. And so gender equitable redistribution of unpaid household work is achievable, right? Which we've demonstrated. You can do it, but it requires the will and the resources to overcome all of these obstacles. So that is that. And I apologize for going over bad share. Oh, I'll stop sharing. Okay. So there's still some time left for questions if there are any thoughts anybody has or comments.
I mean, thank you so much, Thomas. I was just interested in the sort of conflicting results of the time available method on the gender gap and then on the the impact on time poverty itself.
Right.
Was I seeing that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the equal share scenario, right? Because it equalizes shares, it reduces the gap entirely, right? Almost entirely, you saw, right, across the countries, which so it reduces the gap, but it because of the other constraints on people's time spent on income generating work, right, and the minimum levels of personal care, right, that you need, you don't get reductions in time poverty like you do when you use a sharing rule based on the time each individual in the household has available. So under the equal sharing scenario, it can be the case that women's share increases, right? But it's more equal, depending on how many other people in the household there are and what share they're already doing. So it was a kind of a counterintuitive result, but yeah. So, like I said, many of the households, there was just one person with time deficits, and that tends to be women. So even though you might reduce the time deficit, right, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't. It doesn't necessarily reduce their time deficit to zero. That's the point.
Also, if no one is asking a question, then could you go into how you calculated the opportunity cost?
Yeah, sure. So for people with reported wages, we use those. For workers in household enterprises, farms, etc., we imputed their share of the revenue, right, that they're producing. So using a production function kind of approach. And then for everybody else, we imputed their hourly wage by using a kind of a three-stage Hackett procedure to determine what they're likely to earn based on their own personal characteristics. So that in each case relies on the labor market conditions in that country, which for reasons we're all probably familiar with are kind of stacked against women, right, for the reasons I mentioned in my conclusions as well. So, any other questions, comments? There is a Q&A screen that you can type your questions into if you're lurking in the participant pool, among the participants, attendees. Well, not seeing any more. So given that and the fact that our fourth panelist apparently is still technically challenged to connect and get into our session, I will call that a wrap. Unless there are other questions that came up for Shrishti's presentation. And I'll just say, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you, Shrishti, for your presentation, and also Jehan, and also Aman for preparing and then not being able to actually present. So great
great panel, and hopefully we'll all see each other in meet space at some point in the future.
Thank you so much, Thomas.
Take care.